It's a bit of a hard act to follow, Andrew Gumley, so I hope I'm going to tick all Andrew's boxes in terms of how to do it well. Um, so what I'd like to talk about is loneliness, again, in people who experience psychosis. Um, and I want to first think about that through the lens of social identity theory, which I think is particularly helpful. Um, in terms of thinking what might be happening for people with psychosis and also what might be particularly helpful. I then want to go on to introduce Groups for Health, which is a programme based on social identity theory, and finish up by just telling you a little bit about a feasibility trial that I'm currently developing using an adapted version of the Groups for Health programme. Sorry. Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar, social identity theory basically suggests that our sense of self, that is who we are, how we consider ourselves as individuals, is made up primarily of two things. And that is ourselves as a unique individual, personal identity, so our kind of unique characteristics, but also crucially ourselves as a member of groups, so groups that might be particularly important in terms of our sense of who we are. And it's the sense of belonging to those groups that's particularly crucial in terms of health and well-being. Sorry, gone too far. So I think this is particularly problematic for people with psychosis because unfortunately, all too often what happens is with the development of unusual beliefs, perceptually, and also perceptual experiences and so forth, people often end up being categorized to a stigmatized social group, either themselves as they begin to develop experiences, or more often than not, others. And I think within mental health services, and include myself within this, I think we contributed perhaps in no small way to this problem in our eagerness to kind of diagnose people linked to payment by results and so forth. And unfortunately, I think the downside of this categorization process is that people integrate this kind of stigmatized social identity into their sense of self. And I think it's that's particularly toxic and impacts hugely on people's self-confidence and sense of self-efficacy. So readiness to be able to kind of go out and kind of mix confidently with people and develop social networks. So my research is basically trying to see whether it might be possible to develop a slightly different, perhaps more positive trajectory for people. So how I would like to see things develop is that when people start to experience these kind of unusual beliefs, experiences, feelings, etc., that through positive connections with others with similar experiences in a group context, that might enable people to integrate a more positive sense of what it means to have psychosis. So it's really in the first instance about through the kind of empathic connections, the bond, the sense of solidarity that comes from mutual help type groups, helping people to reframe what it means for them to develop psychosis, and then to for people to be able to kind of use that as a platform to then expand their social networks beyond the group. So it's got the element of the connections within the group, but then using that to positively, hopefully impact connections out with the group and to help people to build up connections in their local community. So this work is based on some really, I think, exciting work done by a group of clinical and social psychologists. So I think a really nice integration, largely coming out of Australia. And this group's based in Melbourne, so many of you may already be aware of this work. And it's called Groups for Health. And they've been researching the health impacts of group memberships and group sense of belonging. And just to cut a long story short, the kind of main findings so far seem to be that the more groups that you belong to, the better. I kind of have a sense myself that there must be a kind of peak number. There must be a point at which groups start to become a bit sort of burdensome. Um, Also, that compatibility between groups is important. So it's really important that your groups speak to your kind of values and kind of sense as an authentic person. So, for example, it might be a bit stressful and difficult to belong to, say, Greenpeace and also a far right political group. So there's got to be some sort of compatibility there. Also, times of life change, and that particularly might be when somebody's developing a new health condition, such as developing psychosis, are times of particular vulnerability in terms of social identity. And one of the things that's crucial is maintaining connections through those life transition periods. And that's been evidenced in a number of different groups, but not as yet in people with psychosis. And finally, another aspect that's been found to be helpful is developing new social connections, new social identities, particularly those connected with the life transition that you're going through. So for people with psychosis, that would be connecting with others who have similar kinds of difficulties. And this is found to be particularly beneficial for health and well-being. So we've already heard today about some fantastic programs that are currently underway. So Community Navigator program, we've heard about SEEN. I think it's also worth mentioning I2, which was primarily developed to support young people to engage with early intervention services. But one aspect of it is a group intervention. So it's getting the young people together in a group to for basically for mutual help and support, and also to access activities in the community. So less of an emphasis on groups within the community, but much more generally in terms of social activities, which I think is an important difference. Um, but most of these programs, with the exception of I2, seem to be focused very much on that one-to-one relationship as a vehicle to developing social networks and accessing more social activities. So I guess what I'm interested in, which might be a slight novelty, is the possibility of actually using a group and the mechanism of strengthening identification within the group as the vehicle to helping people extend their networks. And I think it raises some important questions about, can people engage with a group intervention? And I was really interested, one of the speakers was talking about the importance of things perhaps not being randomized and people having the option to choose whether they would like an individual or a group intervention. Also, can a group facilitate connections with other social groups? Is that likely to be effective? And does this confer advantages over a purely individual approach? So just, if you're not familiar, just to introduce you to the Groups for Health programme. It's a relatively brief intervention, so it's only 5 sessions. Each spaced weekly, each lasting an hour and a half long. So the first session is schooling. So what are groups? How can groups, so helping people to think about the groups they might already be part of, which might include family, for example. How can groups help me? Second session, scoping. So thinking about social network mapping, the nature of the kind of relationships between different groups and degree of compatibility, etc. Session 3, thinking about, what do I get from my groups? Crucially, what do I give to my groups? How do you nurture your social groups in order to kind of get the best from them? And the fourth session, thinking about what's missing. So what other kinds of groups might be helpful, and how does that sit with how I view myself as a person? And that would finish then with some problem solving, setting some SMART goals in terms of groups that people might want to try out. And then there's a period of a month's break with the intention that people actually go out and try to access more groups in the community, but with some telephone support through that period. And then there's a final session, which is about evaluating progress and troubleshooting. Okay, so that's broadly the intervention. I've been working with a group, lived experience advisory panel of 6 people with experience of psychosis. And this project also has a steering group, which has people with lived experience, but also clinicians. And we've been thinking about what are the kinds of ways that we might want to adapt this programme, which really was developed for the general public. So it wasn't really developed for people with mental health challenges. And these are some of the thoughts that we've had. So the intention is at the end of this work, hopefully to come up with a manual. So there are things like normalization, so helping people to develop a narrative about their experiences and how their experiences developed in the way that they did in order to help people reframe their experiences more positively. Deconstructing those stigmatized or pathological narratives that are often around. I think it's really important to acknowledge the impact that, for example, medication might have on the ability to socialize and help people to think about how to manage the impact. Challenging those internalized stigmatized views, trying to help people sort of think about things in a more positive sense. A lot of people developing psychosis, we know, do so late adolescence, early adulthood, which is a really important life transition phase when people often do sort of experiment with social skills, developing their confidence socially, making friendship groups, breaking friendship groups. But many of the people developing psychosis, sadly, have missed out on some of those opportunities because of the experiences they've had. So there may be an important aspect of helping people to think about how do you start conversations, you know, how do you go about getting to know people, etc. I think it'll be important to
1 minute, Lorna, if you can finish off, please. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Sonia. So to think about engaging with voices, complex belief systems, mistrust, suspiciousness that might get in the way, and also to think about how much of the psychotic type experiences people might want to share, and which is a very personal decision. So just to leave you with this last slide, so the trial is very much still in the development phase, but this is what we're currently looking at. So we'll be comparing 2 active interventions, individual with group, which feels a bit challenging. Broadly sort of similar in terms of the amount of time that each individual might get. The final 1 month later follow-up debrief session. And then I hope to introduce some qualitative interviews to get people's views on the acceptability and feasibility of the trial. That's me. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm talking while muted as well. A quick question before we go into the groups, just from Domenico is wondering how people can be supported to deal with conflicts or lack of acceptance with groups that they might join in this context.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And part of the project, so the interventions will be delivered by myself and somebody with lived experience together. And one of the things that we plan to do is to build a directory of suitable kind of activities in the community or groups in the community. So I think that's really important to first off is to help people to select groups that might be consistent. So it comes back to that compatibility. So really important to consider groups that might be kind of appropriate for people who have these kinds of challenges and might be accepting of people. So I think that's important in the first place. But I think also built into the programme is the notion of kind of reviewing kind of past experiences, thinking about what's worked, what hasn't worked so well, helping people think about how they could perhaps approach things differently, in the hope that that might make for more success the next time.